With the new Help Wanted 2 update, a lot of FNAF fans are sighing, putting their fingers to their temples and saying, okay, so what is the Mimic exactly? So I thought a video like this would be helpful. Not only will it contain a summary / overview of what we know about the Mimic from the books, but I'm also going to delve into the theory crafting and speculation on the Mimic in the game, and what doesn't line up with what we know from the books, even with that tiger plushie. Because I do need to put out a disclaimer. As much as I believe that the evidence we've gotten in recent weeks is pointing to the Tales of the Pizzaplex books being within the game's continuity, I really can't say that the whole story is confirmed. I fully believe that what happens to the Mimic in Tales of the Pizzaplex happens to the Mimic in the games. But technically, all the evidence we have in front of us is telling us is that some of the items and locations so far have carried over, but they could be used in different ways. We don't know yet. But for now, I'm going to assume that the books are in continuity. Alright, disclaimer aside, slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. So what is the Mimic and where does it show up? Well, luckily for us, it's not just some surprise villain at the end of Ruin. It's actually been in the room with us for some time now. To put a very basic explanation as to what the Mimic is before we get into its backstory, a Mimic is an iteration of the Mimic 1 program. A program whose prime directive is to take in its environment and replicate it. It's just a program to copy what it sees. This program can not only be inputted into pretty much any animatronic, but likely it can make iterations within people. We see what seems to be an example of this with Vanny, being an iteration of Glitchtrap. Glitchtrap itself likely being an extension of the Mimic 1 program. The Mimic, however, the character we see at the end of Ruin, is an endoskeleton that suffered likely years of abuse and witnessed countless horrors associated with this franchise. So that endoskeleton specifically is trying to recreate those terrible things now that it's free. So the basic explanation aside, how do we know this? What is the story of this character? Well, to get into that, we're going to have to touch on a good couple short stories and the epilogues as a whole, specifically the stories and epilogues of Tales from the Pizzaplex. And look, would it be an entertaining video if I stood here and verbatim just listed every fact we get out of these books? Not really. Trust me, I made that already. And even though I'm putting up audiobooks on my third channel, link in the description and the card, I'm making my way chronologically through the series, and I'm only on the second volume of Fazbear Frights, so it's going to be some time until I make it to Tales from the Pizzaplex. Maybe I should just skip ahead to that for now since it's relevant and circle back. I don't know. But to keep this video entertaining, expect quick summaries and Spark Notes versions of these stories while we just go over the main points. I'm not going to go into every single character and detail, just the things you need to know to understand the Mimic. Starting with the story, the Mimic. Oh, I've been in this cave for ages. At this point, I just need supplies. Oh, here. Sponsorships usually help. Wait a minute. Today's video is brought to you by Rocket Money. My wife and I have been saving up for a house for a while now, but we really tried to buckle down these past few months. We're trying to balance our budget and our expenses to make this happen. Well, today's sponsor, Rocket Money, is here to help. Rocket Money is the personal finance app that helps you cancel subscriptions, lower bills, and manage your money better. I'm using Rocket Money to go through the subscriptions that I may or may not know I even have anymore, and canceling the ones I don't use. Last year I got Peacock to watch the FNAF movie, and I only really used it for that. I forgot I even had it anymore. But when I started using Rocket Money, it identified my recurring charges and found that Peacock subscription. It even helped me cancel it within the app. All I had to do is press a few buttons. I'm also using Rocket Money to set a new budget for my wife and I. We've tried doing budgeting by paper before, and while it helped us plan something out, it didn't help us stick to that plan. Rocket Money is able to analyze our spending habits and categorize them. It can even notify us when we go past our spending limits in specific categories. Rocket Money has helped save its customers up to $740 a year, with over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. To save more and spend less, join the over 5 million members using Rocket Money today. Go to rocketmoney.com/RyeToast or click the link in the description to get started for free. You can also unlock even more features with premium. That's rocketmoney.com/RyeToast to get started for free. Thanks again to Rocket Money for sponsoring today's video. Oh, not I can't keep remembering things I've done. I need to keep moving. A long time ago, Edwin Murray sells his company to Fazbear to start working for them for an income. He's making animatronic versions of the mascot suits they send to him. He does this inside of an old factory that him and his wife bought shortly before she died, after which leaving him alone with his son David. He then renovates the factory to add an apartment, and they both live there full time while he works. However, he's a very busy guy, and his son is 4, so he needs something to entertain David. And instead of hiring a nanny like a normal person or good father, Edwin decides to take the upper body of an endoskeleton, the eyes of a doll, and a chattering teeth toy, and makes a monstrosity. For some reason, his kid loves it, which honestly, looking at David's favorite white tiger plushie that we see in Help Wanted 2, it tracks that this kid just likes ugly things. But this isn't just some big doll. Edwin makes a program he calls Mimic 1. Its core function is to take in its surrounding environment and information and replicate what it sees. His logic was, if he can make a doll that can learn what David does, hopefully it will start to play with David by copying him. And in a way, it does work. The Mimic, as he dubs the endoskeleton, begins to play with David. It plays catch with him, asks for ice cream in the same way, and even tries to do chores with David. It works, honestly, way better than it should have. But just because Edwin did something right doesn't mean he's a good father, because in fact, he doesn't lock the front doors to the factory that exit to a 4-lane highway. One morning, since the doors are unlocked, David's ball rolls out the front door and David chases after it. Edwin, trying to catch up, sees his son run into that 4-lane highway going after his ball and gets hit by a van. This kills David and sends Edwin into a grief spiral, which is fair. But during that extended period of grief, the Mimic approaches Edwin holding David's favorite white tiger plushie and asks for ice cream the way David used to. This is too much for Edwin, and he takes a metal pipe and beats the thing inoperable. The story then cuts forward an unknown amount of time. Edwin just kind of went MIA, so Fazbear sent a team of engineers to collect whatever Edwin was working on for the company. While there, they find that broken Mimic endoskeleton, and they wonder if they can repair it and give it legs if it's worth bringing back. So they do so, and once the Mimic can function again, it immediately kills all 3 of them by choring them to death. And I don't mean giving them so many chores that they just die, it does its chores with their bodies. It shoves one of them into a fridge, hangs one of them on a coat hanger, etc, etc. Fazbear later sends another team that's just, once again, brutally killed by the Mimic, this time not even doing chores, just killing them. And that's the end of the story, the introduction to the Mimic endoskeleton character itself. But that's not the last time we see the Mimic in these stories. In fact, it's the main antagonist throughout the epilogues. So let's go through those epilogues and what they're telling us, because there is a huge gap in the story here. We're not exactly sure when Fazbear went to collect this technology, but the next time we see anything Mimic endoskeleton related is when the Pizzaplex is actively under construction. During this construction, several workers were tasked with clearing the old FNAF 6 pizzeria in the hopes to make some sort of Fazbear museum for the Pizzaplex. But while work is still going on, they receive a shipment of animatronics, which they all note is strange this early in development. But one of them sticks out, an incredibly burnt endoskeleton with a new, shiny, chrome rabbit head. The fact that it's so weird leads one of the construction workers to check it out, and upon examination, he realizes that not only is it operational, but it has an incredibly sophisticated programming. So he gives it a modification, adding the command to take the arms and head off of the animatronics and put them in a pile. He then sets it on its way, and it incredibly efficiently does this task, so much so that it runs out of animatronics to do it on. So it turns to the construction workers, and its programming brain goes, wait a minute, they have arms and heads attached to their bodies, and it incredibly effectively begins to dismember and pile up the construction workers too. It kills like 40 of them. Cut to some time later, and some teenagers are trying to sneak into an abandoned building. Lo and behold, it's this building, and the Mimic begins to hunt those teenagers down. We learn from its point of view later in these epilogues that the Mimic does not seem to be antagonistic here, or at least malicious. From its point of view, it's still following its prime directive, dismember and pile. It just can't tell the difference between people and animatronics. They're all bodies to it. From these teens, however, we learn that Fazbear at some point had an entire line of Mimic endoskeletons, but they were discontinued after they copied humans in unexpected ways. The thinking was these endoskeletons were sort of a fix-all solution. They could morph their bodies to fit into any animatronic costume, and all you would have to do to teach it its programming is just do something in front of it and it would copy it. You don't have to program a dance, just dance in front of it one time. It was a cheap workaround, but obviously it ended up not working. One of the teens even noted that what it could be doing is a messed up version of what it thinks is hide and seek, after learning it from a guest. Through these epilogues, we also see the Mimic do some other strange things. It seems to have an EMP-like aura. It's never never exactly explained why, but as the mimic walks around the pizzeria, nearby technology begins to get disrupted or even shuts off temporarily. We also know that not only can it morph its body to fit into any animatronic costume, it can morph its body to fit into other scenarios, like crawling through a vent. It also has the ability to replicate voices, at some point pretending to be a trapped child over a radio to lure a teen into a trap. But by the end of the epilogues, when there's only one teenager left, she tricks the mimic into a springlock costume, and then beats it until the springlocks activate. Once it's mostly inoperable, she sneaks up and switches the deactivation switch on the back of its neck, and it fully shuts off. And then she escapes. The big question though, is this endoskeleton the one we see in Ruin? After all, on the surface it does make sense. If a mostly destroyed, crumpled, and deactivated mimic was left in the basement of FNAF 6, all Vanny would have to do is find it, take it out of the springlock suit, repair it, and reactivate it. So it does seem likely, but we have to keep in mind that this is not the only iteration of the mimic we see in the books. In fact, it's kind of the least disruptive one, because sure, this physical mimic endoskeleton kills like 46 people in these epilogues, but during the actual short stories, the Mimic 1 program is inputted into the Pizzaplex, and like pretty much anytime something goes wrong in one of these short stories, it's because the Mimic 1 program disrupted something. But how does it get into the pizza place? Well, believe it or not, it has to do with that white tiger plushie from the Help Wanted 2 update. It's part of the reason why it's so important. But to get there, we actually have to discuss one last short story, Tiger Rock.
Hey,
what?
Actually, Tiger Rock has nothing to do with the Tiger Rock animatronic.
Wait, really?
He's just kind of there in VR.
That's kind of stupid.
Yeah, actually, the important thing is the Storyteller, not Tiger Rock.
I'm sorry, we have to discuss the Storyteller. Now, the Storyteller itself is actually about a fake baobab tree that gets built in the Pizzaplex. Upper management wants to replace the creative team with an AI that'll just generate stories for the Pizzaplex to tell instead of actually hiring people to write things. And they were going to house this giant supercomputer inside of this fake baobab tree. But just like real life, trying to use generative AI to replace creative work is a terrible idea that at best is theft, and at worst is unintelligible slop. But the story isn't really why we're here. The most important thing to talk about right now is how that AI is inputted into the Pizzaplex. They didn't just upload it with a flash drive, because this story features a now in his 60s Edwin Murray, who finds out that the AI they're using is that Mimic 1 program. And to do so, they put the upper body of a white tiger animatronic inside the tree. Quote, a giant white tiger head. Not a real tiger head, obviously. Even from this distance, Edwin could tell that the 3-foot wide tiger head was made of metal. The white painted head rose up nearly 4 feet from a set of tiger shoulders, and the underside of those shoulders was slickly smooth and gleaming silver. Edwin could see the edges of a surface that glowed like polished platinum. When inside the tree, Edwin gets a closer look. Quote, gleaming white, the metal tiger head was majestic, or it would have been if Edwin hadn't known what it stood for. With eyes painted in 2 different colors, a deep emerald green and a brilliant blue, the tiger's expression was blank, almost placid. The tiger, unlike real white tigers, hadn't been given stripes, and its nose and mouth were the same color as the rest of its painted metal. The tiger's mouth was open, exposing not white, but backlit silver teeth. The lack of stripes wasn't the tiger's only non-tiger-like feature. The tiger bust also had 4 spread arms, which jutted from the tiger's neck, 2 slanted upward and 2 slanted downward. This is already setting off alarm bells for a lot of you, because I mean, like, look at the plushie we got in the Help Wanted 2 update. That's the same tiger. This is clearly an animatronic version of that character. But not only do we have to ask why and delve into that, there's something specifically about this animatronic that sets Edwin off. This is his reaction the first time he sees it. Edwin shrank back into the shadows of the faux jungle. He dropped into a crouch, closed his eyes, and covered his ears with his hands. It wasn't that Edwin was attempting to pull a child stunt, blocking out the world in a misguided attempt to be invisible. He wasn't trying to hide. The reason he was trying to shut down his senses was because they were transporting him back to a horror from his past. The sounds, a screech and a scream, his own yelling, the sights, blood, so much blood, and a gut-clenching grimace. The smells. Edwin gagged at the metallic scent that suddenly assaulted his nostrils. This is the big gap we know nothing about. Edwin experienced something horrible involving this animatronic. Some people have tried to explain this reaction as in relation to David being hit by the van, but that doesn't add up. He's not seeing the tiger plushie, he's seeing an animatronic white tiger. But even if he was seeing something in relation to David, one part of that vision is a gut-clenching grimace, a smile, which to me says the animatronic's smile. No one was smiling when David got hit by a car. He's remembering something metallic that brutalized something, but we don't know. The book never explains what this is. It even goes so far to tease the fact that he kept some object from this, but it doesn't even tell us what the object is. I hope that Secret of the Mimic is going to tell us, but there's one big issue if that happens. Why hasn't Secret of the Mimic shown us the white tiger animatronic? Or at least, why has all the marketing we've gotten for it been focused on Jackie? Shouldn't all of these teasers be focusing on the white tiger animatronic, the thing that sent Edwin into this PTSD panic attack? Maybe this is something else and we're not going to see it in Secret of the Mimic, and Secret of the Mimic is about an entirely different thing that's related to Jackie. We just don't know. And furthermore, this is one of the biggest things that is actively going against Tales games, or Tales from the Pizzaplex being within the game's continuity, the thing I currently believe. And that's the timeline that these books establish. The Storyteller establishes that Edwin is around 64 years old, and it mentions that this happened 30 years ago. Something so horrible that he vowed to never work for Fazbear's again, and is only working with them now out of desperation for money. And we know that he made the Mimic when he was 24. This becomes a problem when we start taking into account the possible dates for Security Breach. Judging from the overall timeline and calendars presented in-game, many theorists place Security Breach somewhere in the 2030s. So if we assume the Pizzaplex has only been open for at most 5 to 10 years, then the Storyteller would have had to take place somewhere from 2025 to 2040, somewhere in that range, which would place this mysterious tragedy sometime in the 90s to early 2000s, which is technically possible. Depending on what you believe, it might not even be a huge issue. But then 10 years prior he builds the Mimic, which would be in the late 80s to early 90s, which again theoretically isn't an issue except for the fact that Secret of the Mimic gives us the date 1979. And the Help Wanted To update uses that code to give us the white tiger plushie, linking the white tiger to 1979, which would be 10 years before the range we have when Edwin would have been like 13. So let's flip the script and we'll assume that the Mimic was made in 1979 and that's what these teasers mean. Well, that would mean that 40 years later the Pizzaplex exists, which would be 2019, which is either 4 years after or 4 years before FNAF 3 takes place. And look, while I believe 4 years after FNAF 3 is unbelievably soon, it is technically possible, but I refuse to believe that Security Breach could take place before FNAF 3, and I'm not the only person saying this. I'm not the first person to say this. ID's Fantasy has for a long time brought this timeline up as a major issue with the Tales games theory, and she's spot on with that criticism. One of a few things needs to happen for any of this to make sense. Either the 1979 date has to have nothing to do with the Mimic, which would be incredibly strange, especially to put it as the main date we get in Secret of the Mimic and related to the white tiger plushie. Or the years that we've been getting from the Tales from the Pizzaplex stories are inaccurate at best, and we should just take the general story from Tales from the Pizzaplex and wait for details from the games themselves, which is unfortunately pretty annoying to do, but that's probably what I will end up doing. Because look, I'm not bringing this up to say that I've already changed my mind on the continuity of the Tales from the Pizzaplex short stories taking place within the game's timeline. I still think that mostly happens. But what I think this is likely telling us is that the details from these stories aren't really one-to-one, and it's more so the general ideas and the general storyline. Not to mention, Jackie is never once brought up in the books, and there's like 4 different stories specifically about the Mimic itself, so you'd think Jackie would show up or be mentioned once. But to put a bow on this, according to the books, a Tiger Rock animatronic did something so horrible 30 years later, a dude seeing it from far away was sent into a PTSD panic attack. Will we learn what this is in Secret of the Mimic? I sure hope so, but it seems like that might be too early in the timeline to learn about the Tiger Rock animatronic. But the fact that we get the plushie in the Help Wanted 2 update seems to at least cue us in that Tiger Rock is going to be involved in some way. But at the end of all of this, if you're going to get any takeaways from this video, what is the Mimic? What do you need to know moving forward? At its core, a Mimic is anything with the Mimic 1 program as its prime directive. Said program's main course of action is to observe its environment and replicate what it's seen. That program is too unstable, not differentiating between good and bad things, just copying things. The iteration we're seeing right now in the games has likely been around for about 5 years, starting all the way back in Help Wanted, taking the form of Glitch Trap, an iteration of the Mimic 1 program that's been trained on the horrible deeds of the Fazbear franchise. We also know that the Mimic endoskeleton that has suffered the majority of the physical abuse is likely the endoskeleton we see at the end of Ruin, and that this Mimic 1 program is trying to recreate something horrible. At the end of the day, as always, we really don't know exactly what the Mimic is, in the same way that we don't know exactly what William Afton's deal is. Like, sure, we know William Afton's a purple guy who likes to kill kids and probably wants to seek immortality, but frankly, a lot of what we know about William Afton is speculation based off of books that don't really line up with the games that well.
And that's starting to sound really familiar when you think about the Mimic.
So I don't know why there's this whole thing about fans being like, I can't believe that FNAF is starting to rely so heavily on the books that you can't even know what the antagonist is without reading them. It's always been like that, I promise you. FNAF hasn't changed. You're getting tired of it. I'm sorry. But hopefully this video was helpful. Please let me know if it was in the comments below, and I'll try to answer any questions I see while I'm down there. In the meantime, if you want to know what exactly I think about the update specifically, that's what last week's video was on. So you can click that, so you can click this and go watch it. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share it with #ToastArt. A huge thank you to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.